Brandon has a lot of cool stuff under his belt. He is a restoration ecologist. He works with the city and he knows a lot about stormwater, a lot about oak trees, obviously. I'll let you take it away though. Thank you.
Hey everybody, my name is Brandon Drucker. Thanks to Luna and the Tacoma Tree Foundation for the opportunity to present today. Like Luna mentioned, I work for the city's passive open space program. So I wanted to share about that program and specifically about the Garry Oak tree that lives in some of the natural areas we manage. So the Garry Oak tree historically defined a very large swath of the South Puget Sound landscape, and it existed as the center of this larger ecosystem. So I'm not just going to talk about the singular tree, but also about the plants and animals that grow alongside it. The ecosystem has certainly been changed over time by development, but the trees are still here. There are large intact populations at Joint Base Lewis McChord to our south. You can also find lots of oaks in rural Pierce and Thurston counties. And even in urban areas like Lakewood and in South Tacoma, we still have relict patches of these trees. They're just often in need of support and restoration. So I want to talk about what that restoration can look like today. So I mentioned I work for the Passive Open Space Program. We're essentially urban natural areas managers. So we work to plan and implement restoration projects on city-owned forests, wetlands, oak woodlands, and stream corridors mainly. We manage for stormwater benefits first. We're funded through stormwater rate dollars. So essentially what that means is we're working to plant vegetation that covers the soil, that's intercepting rainfall and protecting against erosion. There's lots of co-benefits though to that planting, right? So that includes improving wildlife habitat and making our neighborhoods more livable for people as well. These natural areas that we work in, they're not pristine. They're heavily impacted by invasive vegetation and other types of disturbance. So there's lots of folks that we work with in order to carry out restoration of these areas. And, kind of chief among them are the Washington Conservation Corps crews. So I wanted to give a shout out to our crews. They carry out most of our restoration. We also have some carried out by volunteers that are managed through Earth Corps. But the Washington Conservation Corps crews, the city has sponsored them in some form or fashion for over 15 years. They're comprised of young adults and military veterans, and they're out there performing very difficult but critical restoration work. So if you see them out there pushing an erosion control blanket up a steep slope or slogging through a wetland, please give them a thumbs up. And if you know anyone looking to enter the environmental science field, this is a great way to get started. So the Washington Conservation Corps crews are based out of our plant holding facility, which is a funny way of saying nursery, which is located at the Tacoma landfill. So this is where we propagate and care for thousands of native plants that are used in restoration. It's also where we care for street trees that are distributed through the city's separate urban forestry program. And we see this space as really a piece of a complete restoration program. So we actually harvest seed locally, we grow it up at this facility, and then we plant it right back into our local environment. And that includes the Garry Oak trees that are pictured here. So this map is to give an idea of the distribution of passive open space sites across the city. So as you can see, they're well distributed, but our Garry Oak trees are located mainly in South Tacoma at Wapato Hills and Trafton Slope. Nearly all of our sites are regulated critical areas. So that is a land use designation that essentially protects land from development without assessing and addressing environmental impacts. Some folks are familiar with wetlands as, a protected type of critical area, but critical areas also include steep slopes and rare habitats like Garry Oak woodlands and prairies. So I mentioned our two sites with oak trees for the most part include Wapato Hills and Trafton Slope. So Wapato Hills is about 70 acres total. It's one of our largest sites. It was originally purchased by the city as a reservoir location in 1919. It was declared surplus about 50 years later, and then Tacoma Audubon recommended it be preserved as a natural area. So In 1994, the property was divided into two sections. The lower is a recreational space that's managed by Metro Parks Tacoma, and then the top section is a natural area, which is managed by the city's passive open space program. Trafton Slope is about 5 acres, and that one was likely deeded to the city in 1953 because there's utility lines that run through the center of it. And they're only about 3 blocks apart. And you can kind of imagine, you know, before the area was developed, there was a continuous prairie oak woodlands kind of running through that section of town. Okay, so some important themes I want to keep in mind as we move through the slides. You know, glaciers, we all are perhaps familiar with the fact that we live in a very glacially impacted part of the country, right? So glaciers left behind this well-drained, gravelly outwash soil in the South Puget Sound, and that favored oak trees. But over time, it would still fill in with conifers, were these systems not sustained by Indigenous peoples through cultural burning practices. So traditionally, folks would burn the prairies and oak woodlands to promote the growth of staple food plants such as camas, and also to keep them open, which encouraged their use by game animals like deer and elk. I want to emphasize how diverse the flora of the system is. So you might have upwards of 100 species on a prairie next to a lowland conifer forest that, you know, on a good day, you might find a couple of dozen species out there. So it's a pretty stark juxtaposition. And I also want to communicate that these systems, they evolved with humans and they're still dependent on human intervention. So even though it's not taking place in the same form as it did, you know, before colonization, these systems are still very much and always will be tied to humans. So I also wanted to give a land acknowledgement. You know, the Coast Salish people are the original stewards of prairie oak woodlands and the area that's currently covered by the city of Tacoma. I feel truly grateful for their stewardship of this landscape. So I talked a little bit about the staple food crop. So this is probably the best known, which is camas. And there's some Garry Oak trees in the background there. My understanding is camas is, so it's a bulb and it's dug up and then roasted and also prepared in various other ways. I have not tried it yet, but I'm looking forward to trying it someday. Yeah, where there were Garry Oaks historically, there was almost always camas. So I wanted to zoom out a little bit and look at our part of the world here and think about the historic extent of the prairie. So it's generally accepted to align with prairie soils that are denoted here in red. So, you know, roughly 150 years ago, you could stand in what is now DuPont, kind of Steilacoom area, and look out to roughly Spanaway and see nothing but open prairie oak woodland habitat. But obviously these areas have developed and they were often the easiest to develop because there were no old growth, you know, conifer forests there, right? They were prairies. So it would be a lot easier to set up your home and your pasture in a prairie than it would be to, you know, cut down an old growth Doug fir. So, you know, you might notice some of the place names around here have prairie in their name, like Hawks Prairie and Lacey. And yeah, those are kind of the only signs left, right? Unless you're looking at the soil map that a lot of this area was once covered with this type of habitat. So if we zoom out a little bit more, you know, we can see that corridor from DuPont out to Spanaway, but we can also see the prairie soils that stretch across Joint Base Lewis McChord. There's kind of this this whale, kind of looks like a whale shape over here. That's probably the largest, not probably, it is, it's the largest oak woodland left we have in the South Puget Sound. That's still intact. And then you can see how a lot of these areas kind of south of Olympia have been filled in by development. You know, kind of down towards South Thurston County, kind of past Chehalis, a lot of that has filled in with agricultural development. we have confirmation of this historic extent in the form of notes from early Euro-American explorers. I just find these really, really interesting. So this individual, Mr. Breckenridge, writes that Fort Nisqually, which is now about where DuPont is, lays inland a good half-mile from the bay on the plains or margins of the extensive prairies, which stretch back into the interior 15 or 20 miles. The plains were at this season one complete sheet of flowers. This note is a lot more jarring for me. So a few years later, Mr. Cooper writes that the smooth prairies dotted with groves of oaks, which in the distance look like orchards, seem so much like old farms that it is hard to resist the illusion that we are in a land cultivated for hundreds of years and adorned by the highest art. And then he goes on to say, nothing seems wanting but the presence of civilized man. So, it's so jarring because, of course, the prairie oak woodlands, they were cultivated, but not for hundreds of years. They were cultivated for thousands of years by indigenous people. So it just kind of shows this this colonizer arrogance, right? So that's a little bit about the South Puget Sound prairies, and we'll circle back to them later. But I wanted to zoom out even further and look at the Garry Oak tree and its distribution, which goes all the way from Vancouver Island in the north down to Central California, down to Central California. So it kind of follows this well-drained soil, right? So it's in the rain shadow up north in Vancouver Island and the San Juans, and then it follows this well-drained soil through the South Puget Sound, the Willamette Valley, into the Coast Range in Northern California. And then there's these little chaparral patches as well on the California coast and on the east side of the Central Valley. So I was first introduced to Garry Oak trees when I volunteered in college many years ago at Redwood National Park. There are these areas up in the hills known as oak balds. They are really incredible special places. I would highly recommend, if you're traveling through, to take a detour down Bald Hills Road and stop here, because they're just teeming with life. They're surrounded by the tallest trees in the world, by Coast Redwood. And kind of similar to how it is down here in our lowland conifer forests, Coast Redwood forests they're stunning, but they're not very biologically diverse. But in these oak balds, there will just be, all sorts of wildflowers. There's lizards scuttling around, there's birds singing. And it feels like you're in this really just different kind of special space. So after college, I moved to a different type of prairie oak woodland system, and I started working in these systems in Thurston County. And this is fairly typical of what you see there with Mount Rainier in the background. And then the Willamette Valley oak woodland systems have a pretty similar feel. But I just took this picture recently down near Eugene. There's a lot of oak woodlands that intergrade with Oregon ash, where the soil is a little more moist. It's kind of interesting. We don't have a ton of that up here. One thing I wanted to emphasize is just how open these systems are. When we think of woodlands, we might think of a dense cluster of trees, but that's not how these systems were maintained in many places, right? So I had the privilege of working at Joint Base Lewis McChord behind that gate. So I got to see a lot of landscapes that most folks just are not able to access. And we were out conducting plant surveys for 2 years, and we really got to appreciate what that open area does to promote plant growth, right? So having that full sun, that supports just so many more species. They're able to thrive in a way that they can't when there's a really dense canopy, which is kind of contrary to how we're usually thinking, right? We typically like dense canopy, especially in the city, but when you have a diversity of habitats, that can also be really important. So oak trees, we're most familiar with this spreading form, right? Most of the trees around here are pretty large. They have these graceful kind of sweeping branches. But down in California and on the east side of the Cascades, They can grow as much smaller shrubs, depending on the amount of moisture that's available to them. It can even grow as part of a chaparral community in parts of California. They're extremely drought tolerant, so they send down this deep taproot in their first few years of growth. Um, and then once they get established, they're very responsive to rain. So during the spring and fall rains, they have capacity to store a lot of water in their sapwood. And then they have this durable foliage with stomatal control. And what that means is plants are always transpiring, right? So they're taking in carbon dioxide, they're releasing water and oxygen. And during the drought, they might not want to release all that water. They might need to hold on to it to keep their tissues healthy, right? So oak trees are known to have a greater ability than some other plants to close their stomata to hold on to that moisture. And then they also have this specialized conductive tissue. So during drought, plants they can get embolisms. So kind of similar to how humans can get embolisms through their main vessels. Plants can get air bubbles stuck in their main vessels, and so we call that an embolism as well. And that makes it difficult for water to move into parts of the plant, like leaves, that need that moisture. So there are these specialized conductive tissues called vasocentric tracheids that allow water to bypass those main vessels that can develop embolisms, so that water, that moisture, can reach on the far parts of the tree. Oak trees produce acorns, of course, and acorns are so critical for wildlife species. So if you have an oak tree anywhere near you, you will notice the birds are just drawn to it like nothing else. All kinds of woodpeckers and jays, other corvids, and many more species of bird, as well as deer, squirrels, raccoons, and humans traditionally also feed on acorns. Right? The acorns can be ground down into a type of meal. So oak trees, not just Garry oak trees, but lots of other oak species as well, have developed what is probably a predation defense strategy where they'll produce acorns irregularly from year to year. So some years they might not produce any. And then other years they will just drop, thousands of acorns in an effort to, we think, overwhelm predators. So, there's going to be so many that inevitably many will hopefully be cached, forgotten about, and then germinate ultimately. So there have been lots of studies, mostly on eastern oak species, that show that caching by corvids and by squirrels are really important to oak reproduction, right? Because those squirrels and birds, they're well fed enough, or they just forget about those acorns and they'll actually germinate. They'll have the seed soil contact they need to start growing underground. So along with being really drought tolerant, oak trees are fire tolerant as well. So I mentioned this system is fire. It's evolved with fire. Fire is a critical piece of it. So Garry oak trees, they have evolved this sort of bark that can really take fire once the trees get big enough. So low intensity fires are very rarely going to kill a grown oak tree, right? And then even the small oak trees, when they burn, they're usually just going to be top killed. So that's what we call it when the top branches die off, but then the base will resprout the vast majority of the time. Fire will also release oaks from competitors, right? So they have no one to compete with when the fire has burned through, right? So again, conifers would encroach into the system and the fires would wipe out conifers historically. And then the oaks had this advantage because they were fire adapted in a way that small conifers were not. So we talked a bit about camas and oak trees. I also wanted to take a moment and talk about the humble bunch grass we call Romer's fescue. So when we think about grasses, we might think about our lawns or our pastures where there are dense turf forming grasses, right? And those turf forming grasses don't leave a lot of space for other species. But bunch grasses like Romer's fescue, they just grow in these these little clumps, and there's all this negative space around them where there's then room for wildflowers to grow. So Romer's fescue is kind of the dominant bunch grass that comprises these systems when they're healthy. On the left there, woodland shooting star, and the Lashutsi name for that plant is Stilicum. So the town of Stilicum actually gets its name from that plant, though I think you'd be very hard pressed to find it now in Stilicum. Then there's lots of pollinators, of course, that are enjoying all the wildflowers that grow in these open areas. And then on the right is actually our native cucumber called manroot, and it's just scaling that Garry Oak tree. It's a picture from JBLM as well. Okay, so there's all kinds of asters. I'm going to try to move through these flower pictures quickly because I could be here all day. But yeah, all kinds of asters, lots of saxifrage species, lilies. On the bottom left is an orchid that grows out in the prairie called hooded lady's tresses, or spiranthes. Kind of has this spiraling inflorescence. We have our native sunflower, the Puget balsam root. There's a couple of species of native violet, lots of carrots, bluebells, columbine, and clarkia on the bottom right. We also have our native paintbrush on the top right, harsh paintbrush. There's a few others that grow out on the prairie as well. And then our blanket flower. And one thing also that's special about this suite of species is it will grow here on the west side, and then not all, but many of these species you can also find on the east side. So they're also kind of drier adapted species, right? So along with all the good plants, we have some less good plants. There are several species that were brought over probably in the hooves of livestock, and sometimes intentionally by Euro-American settlers. And in many cases, they have completely type changed this landscape, right? So where once there was a field of diverse wildflowers, now there's just this oxeye daisy, and it's kind of pretty, but it's that's all there is. They don't leave room for much else. I just remember I took a picture of one of these fields of oxeye daisy at JBLM, and I sent it to my friend, and she told me it looks like you're in the middle of an allergy commercial, and that is how I felt. It's a very sneezy kind of species too. And then on the right, folks are probably used to seeing Scotch broom if you live on the West Coast. Scotch broom is notable for the way it changes the soil chemistry around it, right? It fixes nitrogen and it makes the soil more suitable for weeds. Go figure, one of the best ways to control invasive species is to do what indigenous peoples have done for thousands of years. It's to light these areas on fire. There's a lot of prescribed burning that happens on Joint Base Lewis McChord, and there's a little bit that happens in Thurston County. I was actually a type 2 wildland firefighter for just a minute. So this looks totally devastating, right? But it's not. So, all that dead Scotch broom is really a good thing. And you'd be so surprised, within a couple weeks, you'll have all the native plants resprouting. And it's the areas that are burned most frequently that are the healthiest, far and away. So, my former job at JBLM and many others don't exist just because, the military cares about butterflies of their own volition. They care about these plants of their own volition. It's because they're required to care about them by the Endangered Species Act in particular. So, the Taylor's checker spot butterfly is protected by the ESA, as is the golden paintbrush pictured on the right, pocket gophers and streaked horn larks as well. And those species are all extirpated from our urban areas. You can find some of them in a couple of prairies in Thurston County. And then locally, our oak woodlands and prairies are protected by critical areas ordinances. So in Tacoma, Title 1311 protects oak woodlands. And then I wanted to share the Pierce County Code Title 18E, which explicitly protects even individual trees having a diameter at standard height of 20 inches or more. So they, explicitly lay out not just protection of this system, but even individual trees if they're large enough. So about this time last year, there was a fire at Wapato Hills. If you live in South Tacoma, you might be aware of this already. And once I knew everyone was safe, honestly, I was not that sad about it, because this system, who knows the last time it burned in South Tacoma, right? Because it's been developed all around it. And as a result of that, this area looked unhealthy to me. It was really choked with dense invasive species and shrubs. It wasn't that open kind of prairie that you'd see at JBLM or in Thurston County or elsewhere. And it presented this incredible opportunity for restoration. Just a couple blocks south at Trafton Slope, we had a different type of disturbance that left opportunity for restoration. So, every year we would come back to this site, and the footprint of these like illegal BMX trails would just be growing more and more. And it's not a very large site, so it started getting, substantial. They're really damaging the integrity of the system. And so we decided, we had to find a path forward that benefited the environment more. I want to be clear that, in restoring these systems, we are not under any illusion that we're bringing back the pre-colonization plant community, but we can bring back many native plants, and we can restore the function of the system. And oftentimes we have to do that by completely reintroducing these native species because they've been eliminated from the seed bank. It's been so long since they've had a chance to grow here, right? Because invasive species have moved in. So you can see on the bottom there, we have lots of blackberry brambles. We cleared them out, and now we have this kind of fresh area of soil where we can try getting some native plants going. And so we might do that first by direct seeding. So we used a bunchgrass mix that is about 50% native bunch grasses, mostly that Romer's fescue that we looked at earlier. And we protect the seed from predation, from birds and rodents by just pushing it lightly into the ground with our shoes and covering it with a light layer of straw. And you'll have the best germination if you spread in early fall. And we really did have awesome germination. I'll show some photos in just a minute. A lot of restoration work on the prairies and in oak woodlands is done through propagating plants in plugs. So this is a picture from JBLM as well, where we just sprinkle seeds into these plugs, and then you can just auger small holes or just with a shovel, dig out small holes and just stick the plants in already grown. So you might choose to do that depending on, the urgency of the restoration need, or, we have a relationship with the Center for Natural Lands Management down in Tenino. So they allowed us to visit their native seed farm and actually dig out our native forbs, and we loaded up a couple truck beds and drove them back to Tacoma and stuck them in the ground. And so we planted along with seeding in both of our sites, Wapato Hills and Trafton Slope. So this is a picture of Trafton after the restoration, immediately after. So we planted oak trees along this pathway here, and then we seeded along the pathway. Another view of Trafton. And then here at Wapato Hills, the Washington Conservation Corps crews, they seeded about an acre of area just all by hand. They got it all done in like half a day. It was really, really impressive. And we know it worked because just a couple months later, around April, we had pretty impressive germination rates. So we had lots of Oregon sunshine and Romer's fescue coming up. We had lots of fireweed, annuals like Gilia and Clarkia. And this is one of those situations where, if you build it, they will come, right? So we put all this wildflower seed out, and the pollinators they came to it, before there was only grass, which doesn't really attract pollinators, but we put some flower seed out there, and all of a sudden the area was just buzzing. And it was really, really cool to see that transformation. There are other woody species that are associated with these systems that are fire adapted. So on the left is a madrone tree. that resprouted following the fire at Wapato Hills. And on the right is a blue elderberry. And I was so impressed with that tree. That is just 1 year growth. So it also got, we talked about top killing. This elderberry got top killed, but then it just sprouted, I don't know, probably 10 feet up in one season. So we actually monitored the area that we seeded at Wapato Hills with 1x1 quadrats. That's me and one of the crews out there counting the plants that are coming up. It was a novel type of restoration because, to our knowledge, the area had never been burned and seeded since it was developed. So we were really curious to see how things came up, and so that we could make better decisions moving forward, about what species to prioritize. I have been thinking about, how best to support oaks and their habitat in the South Sound, and a couple of thoughts about, if you have space for it, it'd be great if you could plant an Oregon white oak tree or a Garry oak tree. You need a bigger space, you need somewhere that's a little bit drier. But if you can, these make beautiful shade trees, and they are going to help increase that urban forest canopy. And then along with that tree, as many of those wildflowers as we can bring back, I think it really, really helps define a space. They're so colorful. They're so cool to see, being appreciated by pollinators and other wildlife. And it's just fun, with kids and friends, just to spread the seed around and then watch everything grow back up. So you can find prairie oak seed mixes out there. I can't officially endorse anything, but I'm happy to talk later offline about what's out there. And then we have lots of volunteer restoration events. So our volunteer events are managed by Earth Corps, and you can register and find out more information at that link there. And then there's lots of, well, not lots, there are a couple of advocacy groups here in the South Sound. And then if you look further afield, there are several others to tap into. And there's really this rich network of partners out there. And I think the best way to stay tuned in is to join the Cascadia Prairie Oak Partnership listserv. Check the Center for Natural Lands Management website. They have historically managed many of the prairie oak woodlands in South Thurston County. And then there's a lot of research being taken on by UW and Evergreen, and usually in partnership with one of the Fish and Wildlife agencies. If you want to visit one of these systems, Wapato Hills is a great one here in South Tacoma. There's also South Park, which is managed by Metro Parks Tacoma. And then if you want to take a drive down to Thurston County, Mima Mountains Natural Area is really neat. Along with the oak trees and all the flowers and grasses, there are also these kind of undulating mounds that are this sort of geological marvel. And then Scatter Creek Wildlife Refuge, also in Thurston County, is a great accessible place. So thank you again so much for listening to me.
Thank you for giving us that lovely presentation. Yeah, that was so cool. Thank you. I learned so much. What would you recommend that we can do to protect Garry oak trees?
Yeah, so I know this is coming up more and more, right, as we see kind of our urban centers expand out. And I think we need to start by protecting what's already there, right? We need to start by protecting the oldest trees that take centuries to grow, that are offering us so much. And it's not always really easy to quantify, right? But even these oak trees at the fringes of Tacoma and Lakewood are benefiting us in these huge ways. They provide so many ecosystem services. And so I think, kind of doing what we can to rally around them is important. I think there are also opportunities for preserving some of those areas, as opposed to developing them. I think, speaking with the powers that be about green space acquisition and about how best to preserve those trees is a path forward. I think after we've preserved what we have left, I think it's worthwhile to explore how to kind of reclaim as much of that habitat as we can, or maybe not reclaim, but bring it back into our neighborhoods, right? So planting oak trees where there's space for them, planting that understory where there's space for them, and and I think just sharing in that with the community is really cool, right? Because people do get excited about the flowers and about seeing that that color appear.
Everybody benefits in some way when you when you get all these trees out. Yeah, so oaks are they've been in this area for thousands of years. What other trees would you say are really important to learn about? Um, yeah, I guess that are also that are also native to this area or indigenous to this area.
Yeah, I mean, Tacoma Tree Foundation does a good idea of kind of elevating, many of those species. There are some species that we think of as, sort of underrepresented, right? I was recently talking to another Tacoma Tree Foundation regular about this. Madrone is one, right? That pops to mind. That's really charismatic. That used to be more prevalent.
Yeah.
That, we've lost a bit of through urban development and for other reasons. But I think getting in touch with our conifers is important. Doug fir is a big one, but there's lots of others mixed in as well. But then, I also want to give credit to the understory, right? Like we focus so much on trees, and I love trees too. But I think our shrubs need some love, actually.
Yeah.
Like our shrubs provide a lot of benefit, and getting better acquainted with plants like ocean spray and snowberry and red flowering currants and Oregon grape. I think that's a good way to go too.
Yeah, I think in your presentation made a very compelling argument for like all the little guys. I was like, all right.
Absolutely. Yeah, all the herbaceous plants too. Yeah, trees are great, so are shrubs and herbaceous plants.
Very nice. So we have a question. They said, thank you so much for the presentation. Can you, they want to know more about the seed collecting process for Garry Oaks, and if they can be planted as street trees. And I'm going to combine a question here. When you're collecting seeds and stuff, how do you make sure there's like a good genetic diversity in there too?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
So a three-part question, but I can repeat it if you want.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. So for Garry Oak trees, so I honestly have not collected a ton of acorns over my time. I inherited a lot of Garry Oak trees at the nursery, so we've been working to get those out. But we did collect some recently, and what we're gonna try doing is, so you want to collect them about now, kind of in the fall, late summer, fall, and then what we're gonna try is soaking them in water for a couple hours right before we kind of push them into the soil. And we don't want to bury them too deep, kind of just under the soil, so there's enough seed soil contact to trigger germination. And what you want to do is just leave them outdoors. You can kind of push the acorn in the late fall, and then it'll naturally kind of stratify. You call it stratification when the seed stays out through the winter, through that period of cold, that dormancy period. It'll trigger the seed to germinate when the temperature just starts to rise after it's been chilled out. And then in terms of collecting to promote genetic diversity, it's a really good question. And there's all these fascinating conversations right now about how we want to source seeds with climate change. And if we want to actually start sourcing from further south, right, along this longitudinal gradient where, like it's predicted that our climate is going to resemble the climate of Portland, right, in the not too distant future. So does it make sense to collect Garry Oak acorns from the Portland area? And I think it probably does. And so, you might consider sourcing from further south. But basically the general rule of thumb is you want to mix it up, right? You don't want to grab all your acorns from one tree. You don't want to deplete that area. You want to try and mix it up as much as possible. Kind of hedge your bets.
Yeah. Going off that, so aside from sourcing them from farther south, maybe. Is there anything else, I guess, related to them, their climate change resilience that you would that you have opinions on, or not opinions, but want to talk about?
Yeah, I got lots of opinions. Yeah, I mean, I think because they have all these drought tolerant features, they're potentially one of our climate change rock stars, right? We have lots of species that are vulnerable that we're already seeing die back. And Garry Oaks, because they're so drought tolerant, I think we're likely to see them fare better. And so I think we should probably start mixing them into our restoration sites and perhaps our neighborhoods more often. And here it's really potentially this restoration of a cultural landscape as well. So there's all these
Mhm.
co-benefits. And that reminds me, there was a question about using them as street trees.
Mhm.
And my understanding is they don't make awesome street trees where there's kind of a narrow right of way
Right. Yeah.
or a narrow planting strip. But if you have a really big planting strip, because they have these big spreading roots and these big spreading crowns, I think they might be an appropriate choice, but probably better suited for really large planting strips or your yard. As much as you're willing, like get your hands dirty, because there's so much opportunity for that, and it feels really good, right, to get out there and actually participate in management of these systems that are in such need of support. So I would encourage folks to check out that Earth Corps page to volunteer with the Passive Open Space program in Tacoma,
Yeah.
and to do a little bit of research about what groups are active in Lakewood and other areas that are kind of facing these different development pressures.
That's the end of our session here. Thanks to Tacoma Creates for funding this. And yeah, go visit Wapato and go say hi to all the plants.